Good morning. Well, welcome to the third lecture of the history of the era of the Civil War. Today's title is Texicans and Tyrants, the Annexation of Texas. A couple of years ago, I had a student who laughed at the word Texican. I think the student thought that I was making the word up. A combination, obviously, of the word Mexican and Texan. But I wasn't making the word up. This is how Texans often referred to themselves at this time, the 1830s and so forth, as Texicans. So Texicans and Tyrants, the annexation of Texas. This is about the rebellion of Texas against Mexico. This is not to be confused with the Mexican War of 1848, about which I will lecture next time. So the first thing you want to do is distinguish in your minds between the Texican revolt, which features the Battle of the Alamo, and then the Mexican War. Before I start on the lecture this morning, though, I would like to begin the class with the Lord's Prayer. So, would you pray with me, please? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Texicans and Tyrants. Americans believed they had a God-given right to expand across North America. They had a name for this right. They called it manifest destiny. Manifest, obvious. Determined is another way to say destiny. So God had given us this land. It was obvious we were destined to have it. This land lust was most clearly manifest in the Mexican borderlands known as Texas. By the 1830s, more Americans lived there than in all of the other coveted regions of the West. Andrew Jackson, President of the United States throughout most of the 1830s, tried to buy Texas from Mexico, but the Mexicans refused. Given subsequent events, perhaps the Mexicans would have been better advised to go ahead and sell Texas at the best price they could get. Americans continued to pour into Texas. Mexico welcomed them in the 1820s as a means of providing a civilian population that conceivably would help them defend Texas and Mexico, for that matter, from Spain. Spain, of course, had been the original owner of this territory, original in terms of Europeans anyway. But the Mexicans had revolted against Spain in 1822 and secured their independence. But that didn't mean the Spanish were at all happy about that. And so Mexico thought these largely American Texicans might help them defend Mexico, especially Texas, from a resurgent Spain. The greatest promoter of American settlement in Texas was a man by the name of Stephen F. Austin. And Austin's father had received a huge land grant from Mexico, the point being to encourage Americans to come settle Texas. Austin then started a colony on the lower Brazos River in 1821. Of course, the capital city of Texas, Austin, bears this man's name. Soon, over 2,000 American immigrants lived in Texas. This would be the mid-1820s. They were a mixed group of large ranchers and southern farmers moving west who hoped to find new lands for the growing, important cash crop of the South, cotton. One young settler who came southwest with her husband wrote, "I was a young thing then, but 5 months married. My husband failed in Tennessee. I was ready to go anywhere and freely consented. Texas fever rose then, so there we must go. And there, without much reflection, we did go." So here's a young woman who's part of the westward movement. The origins of the Texan Rebellion. In 1830, the Mexican government, now after a decade of American immigration, grew alarmed at the flood of Americans who were coming into Texas. And so now they closed immigration. Good luck with that, right? One of the motives for the Mexicans in doing this was slavery. For Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829. The Texicans, of course, that is most of them, were bringing their slaves with them into Texas, for example, to work the cotton fields. The Mexican prohibition of immigration, not surprisingly, had no effect. Americans continued to stream across the border, just as Mexicans do today. By 1835, there were 30,000 American settlers in Texas. 30,000. This is 10 times the number of Mexicans who lived there. On the other hand, the Mexican government was clearly incompetent at this time and incapable of performing the basic duties of government. And one must admit the Mexican government's presence in Texas, the sheer number of Mexican officials, soldiers, etc., was relatively small. Even if they were extraordinarily efficient and competent, they would have had difficulty controlling Texas. But they were not. In 1832, 1833, the Americans then organized themselves into a convention to demand not independence from Mexico, but their own state within the Mexican government. So they would govern their own state pretty much as well at this time as American states did within the American government, so more of a federal system. But instead of granting their request, which again, in retrospect, would have been wise, the leader of Mexico, General Santa Anna, abolished the Mexican government and created a dictatorship. So he is doing away with the central Mexican government and became a dictator at this time. And so he refuses then the Texicans' request for a state of their own. And it would seem obvious to me, gave the Texicans all of the legitimate reasons they needed to rebel. And it's helpful to understand Texas was not the only Mexican province to rebel against this usurpation of power by the dictator Santa Anna. No doubt many Texicans remembered Thomas Jefferson's remarks concerning the tree of liberty. Jefferson said the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So now the Texicans called a convention and wrote a declaration of causes, similar to the American Declaration of Independence on the eve of the American Revolution. And this declaration of causes explains their causes for rebellion. And they declared independence in March of 1836. In brief, the Texicans were afraid that the dictator Santa Anna would take away what right to rule themselves they had enjoyed all these years. They were also afraid, of course, that Mexico would emancipate their slaves, that Mexico would end slavery in Texas. One must confess, one must observe that this was one of the reasons for rebellion. In a significant way, then, this rebellion was a foreshadowing of the American Civil War. Santa Anna marched north to put the rebellion down. Indeed, as the declaration was made public, Santa Anna had surrounded a small group of Texans at an abandoned Catholic mission in San Antonio. You can see Santa Anna's line of march north through northern Mexico, and then he turns to the east as he invades Texas. The Mexican army delivered its first blow at that mission, the Alamo, in February of 1836. Santa Anna demanded now that all 185 defenders of the Alamo surrender. And the Texicans answered with a cannon shot. Over the next 12 days, the siege of the Alamo takes about 12 days. Days that bought the Texicans time to raise more troops in other parts of Texas. Santa Anna repeatedly attacked the brave defenders and suffered fearful losses in the process. At one point, the commander of the Alamo, Colonel William B. Travis, drew a line in the ground with his sword as he addressed his men in a shaking, emotional voice. He said to them, "Those prepared to give their lives in freedom's cause, come over to me." That is, step forward and cross this line. Every man, every single defender of the Alamo crossed the line. The notorious slave smuggler, Indian fighter, and inventor of the Bowie knife, James Bowie, who was ill with pneumonia and prostrate on a cot, asked that his cot be picked up and carried across the line. In the pre-dawn hours of March 6th, 1836, the last day of the stalwart stand at the Alamo, the Texans were awakened by Mexican bugles. And the Mexican buglers were playing the dreaded Deguelo. This tune signified that the Mexican army had no intention of giving quarter, that is, taking prisoners. No mercy would be shown to the defenders of the Alamo. Davy Crockett, the great American frontiersman and one of Andrew Jackson's men during the Creek War, who had come to Texas to find adventure, he found it at the Alamo. He said to his comrades on this last day, "Pierce the heart of the enemy as you would a feller that spit in your face, knocked down your wife, burnt up your house, and called your dog a pesky skunk. Cram his carcass full of thunder and lightning, and like a stuffed sausage, and bite his nose off into the bargain." Crockett's Tennesseans and the rest of the defenders would not go quietly into the night. Santa Anna's men attacked from every side that morning, but were twice thrown back. But on the third charge, as the Texans ran out of ammunition, the Mexicans breached the battered north wall and poured into the interior of the compound. Colonel Travis took a bullet to the forehead. Jim Bowie, fighting from his cot, emptied his pistols into those bursting through the door, threw his knife, but then took many, many bullet wounds. Still, the defenders fought on, now only in small groups. Davy Crockett and other frontiersmen turned their empty rifles, again out of ammunition by this time, into clubs and hammered at the Mexicans for a few moments until they too were killed. Santa Anna ordered the captured Americans. Some were wounded, some surrendered at the very last moment. And so there were prisoners. Santa Anna ordered them executed, and they were. Not a man survived in the Alamo. It was a complete victory for the Mexicans, but a costly victory. The Texicans, over those 12 days, had killed Santa Anna's soldiers at a ratio of 8-1. Normal casualties for an attacking force against a fortified position like a fortress would be 3-1. So the Mexicans could have expected to spend a lot less of their own blood to take the Alamo, but the Texicans exacted a fearful toll. And during this time, all of Texas now learns of this fabulous and immortal stand at the Alamo. So all of Texas now is inspired to fanatical resistance. But more importantly, what happened at the Alamo was that Colonel Travis and his soldiers bought the rest of Texas time, almost 2 weeks, to organize and prepare to meet Santa Anna on some other ground. Sam Houston in the Battle of San Jacinto. The commander-in-chief of the Texicans was General Sam Houston. Houston, like Crockett, was a Tennessee frontiersman who had, again, learned war under the tutelage of Andrew Jackson. Houston now conducted a strategic retreat to the east, gathering volunteers, recruits, as he went. And so Houston uses the time that the defenders of the Alamo had given him. He used it very well. And Houston now finally decides to make a stand at the battle, or at a place called San Jacinto, a river near the city, Houston, that now bears his name. On April 21, 1836, Houston and his army of Texicans surprised Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. They went on the attack, not something that Santa Anna was prepared for. The Texicans charged, remember the Alamo! And within 15 minutes, that overwhelmed the startled and surprised Mexican army. And they had taken Santa Anna prisoner. Now the Mexican dictator bought his freedom for the price of a treaty which recognized Texan independence. So Santa Anna signs the treaty, and this, in the way that many nations and peoples have achieved their freedom by war, was recognized at that time as a legitimate means of settling a dispute. So Texas is independent from Mexico because of this war and victory at the Battle of San Jacinto. And so eventually Santa Anna is given his freedom and allowed to leave. The Nueces River, not the Rio Grande, with which we are so familiar, the Nueces River, which is a little bit north of the Rio Grande, was the established border in East Texas. This is important because this will be a factor in the coming of the Mexican War in the next decade. Annexation. How does Texas become an American state? It is independent from Mexico at this time, but it's not an American state. The Texans created what they called the Lone Star Republic. They made Sam Houston president, not surprising, and they voted for annexation into the United States. The Texicans were largely Americans, and they wanted to be Americans again. But the situation in the United States was complicated in the 1830s and would continue to be in the 1840s, 50s, and obviously during the Civil War in the 1860s. The addition of a new slave state at this time, when Congress was beset with abolitionist petitions, threatened a sectional quarrel, North versus South, that might cause Andrew Jackson's hand-picked successor in 1836, Martin Van Buren, to lose that presidential election. And so Jackson does not want to pick a quarrel with the abolitionist North. And I overstate the point there. The North is not abolitionist at this point, but there are a number of people who are. But by the 1830s, the North is beginning to cast a very, very wary eye on Southern slavery. But we're still 2.5 decades away from the Civil War. Anyway, Jackson and Van Buren don't want a contest over slavery in this presidential election. And so the Texas question, it's a slave country now, that is going to have to hang fire. It's going to have to wait. John Quincy Adams, former president, John Quincy Adams was president just before Jackson from 1825 to 1829. He was symbolic of the Northern view of slavery. That's overstating it a little bit. John Quincy Adams is absolutely set against the expansion of slavery into the territories. Not every Northerner was of that opinion, but he was symbolic of those Northerners who were opposed to the extension of slavery into the territories. His eloquent speeches in the House of Representatives after he was president, here's a Trivial Pursuit question for you. He is the only American president to then be elected to Congress after he was president of the United States. And he gave eloquent speeches in the House of Representatives over those 17 years that popularized the view that Southern slave owners had engineered the Texan rebellion and thus the drive for annexation, because these Southern slaveholders of the American South, they wanted Texas to come into the Union as a slave state to strengthen their position. This was not true. I've already explained the origins of the Texan rebellion, but politics is passionate. And if you can cast the other side with certain aspersions and conspiracy theories and so forth, then oftentimes one does that. In addition, if the United States had annexed Texas, it would have raised the possibility of a war with Mexico. Mexico was not happy about the loss of Texas, and for Texas to go from being an independent state that might one day become part of Mexico again to becoming an American state, well, that might tinder warfare between the two nations, Mexico and the United States. Jackson now secretly advised Texas to bide their time, take it easy. And if possible, he suggested the Texans to move themselves out west and take California. This is before the gold rush, before the Mexican War and so forth. And then California, Jackson thought, would come into the Union as a free state, Texas as a slave state, and the Northerners would be willing to make that compromise, a kind of compromise they had made many times. Publicly, Jackson did not even recognize the existence of the so-called Lone Star Republic until his last day in office in early 1837. Now it gets a little bit complicated, and it's not too important, but I'll tell you how this goes down. In 1838, with the annexation of Texas before Congress, Adams carried on a 3-week filibuster, think just in terms of stall, and presented hundreds of petitions, individual petitions against annexation. Adams' efforts defeated annexation in 1838 and caused the Texans to begin to think of their own empire at this time. Under the new president, Mirabeau Lamar, Houston now is off the scene, so to speak. Texas took advantage of Jackson's advice and made plans to expand to the Pacific Ocean. France and Great Britain, always looking for another source of cotton besides the American South, recognized the existence of Texas, that is, the existence of Texas as an independent state. And Texas began to supply them with cotton. Most Texans, however, were Americans and remained staunchly opposed to the idea of a permanent separate Texas republic. They wanted to become Americans once again. Growing British influence in Texas, after all, they'd recognized Texas as an independent state, created anxiety in America, both North and South, regarding the future of Texas. Southern slaveholders and cotton growers continued to agitate for annexation. Secret negotiations between the United States and Texas commenced in 1843 under the direction of President John Tyler. But the Texas issue would have to, again, wait through the presidential election of 1844. So politics in the United States is dictating the situation in Texas. The Whigs, largely the party of the North, largely the holdovers from the old Federalist Party, the Whigs nominated Henry Clay, who was initially against annexation. The Democrats nominated James K. Polk, who was an unequivocal expansionist. Not only does he want Texas to come into the Union, but he wants California, the Oregon Territory. He is for manifest destiny to continue to march to the west. Cleverly, then, Polk argued not only for annexation of Texas, but also of the Oregon Territory. At this time, Oregon belongs to Great Britain. So arguing for the annexation of Oregon would give Northerners, because the Oregon Territory is not going to be slaveholding, would give Northerners something to swallow accepting Texas as a slave state. This combination of Southern, Northern, Western expansion was a winner, and Polk won the presidency in 1844. During the campaign, Clay began to soften on the issue of annexation, which backfired because few Democrats were going to vote for Henry Clay anyway. And when he began to soften on annexation, that is, began to make noises about accepting Texas, the Whigs of New York essentially deserted Henry Clay. They formed a third party, the Liberty Party, and the loss of these New York Whigs cost Clay New York, which cost him the election. With the election of 1844 over, congressmen now chose to view the results of that election as a mandate, a call for annexation. Tyler asked Congress to accomplish annexation by joint resolution, which requires only a simple majority instead of by a treaty ratification, which requires a two-thirds vote in the Senate. So it would be easier to do this by resolution than by treaty. After a bitter debate over slavery, the resolution passed the Senate, and Texas achieved statehood, entered the Union in December of 1845. Summary. The story of Texas annexation illustrates the determination of the American people to move west, to occupy as much of North America as they possibly could in the 19th century. And they did this often without the help of their government. It also demonstrates that the American conception of liberty was both restricted to white males and also in a state of redefinition. Because of this confusion, who does liberty apply to? Freedom and equality. Texas would remain a state for only 16 years. Well, I thank you for your time, and as always, God bless you all.